Everyone. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming at the Kansas City Public Library, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to welcome all of you and to introduce somebody who is truly one of the most reliably high-quality presenters that we've had here in my 17 years at the library. But first, I want to take a quick moment to invite all of you back here next Tuesday for the start of the library's 150th anniversary celebration. We will have Tommy Lightio will be the keynote address at 7, but from 6 to 7 you can come in. We'll have an upgraded reception in that hour. We'll have live music from the Fantastics. Vine Street Brewery will have their library collaboration beer, One for the Books. You can sample that. Jay Rieger is producing a specialty cocktail, so we'll have that for you. And then a great public lecture as well. That one is filling up quick, so if you haven't already, I would encourage you to RSVP. But first, we have a great presentation tonight. I'm not certain, but I believe this marks the 7th time that Gary Kremer is presented as a part of our signature event series, either alone or as part of a conference. And that's not terribly surprising, given that he's authored or edited 12 books on the state of Missouri and some of its most notable figures. I suspect that he would be a great presenter on any topic, but when he talks about Missouri, it's different. His commitment to our state and to our shared history is always evident. Tonight, he shares with us stories from his newest book, This Place of Promise, a historian's perspective on 200 years of Missouri history. It was conceived as a way to commemorate Missouri's bicentennial, but the book is part love letter and part honest criticism of the state he calls home. Gary is a 5th-generation Missourian. He taught for 15 years at Lincoln University in Jefferson City and for 5 years at William Woods in Fulton. And next year, he will celebrate 20 years as Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri. Please welcome Dr. Gary Kremer.
Thank you so much, Steve. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for allowing me to be here tonight to talk about my book, This Place of Promise. As Steve said, this book was conceived as a way to commemorate Missouri's bicentennial of statehood. We were 200 years old as a state on August 10th, 2021. Although I may not have articulated it clearly at the time, in writing this book, I was trying, among other things, to answer a nagging question. Why are we Missourians the way we are? The answer I knew intuitively lay in our history. I remember a few lines from one of my favorite books, Robert Penn Warren's A Place to Come To, published in 1977. In that book, Warren has the protagonist, Jake Tewksbury, say this, quote, "We're all stuck with trying to find the meaning of our lives, and the only thing we have to work on or with is the past." Tewksbury added, "This can be a question of life and death." In pondering this question of the meaning of our lives and why we are the way we are, I had to first turn that question inward and ask myself, why am I the way I am? And I quickly realized that the answer to that question, too, lay in the past. I further realized, before I could undertake a study of my home's state history, I had to grapple with the meaning of my own past and now how it had shaped and informed my present. I soon discovered that something Mark Twain wrote more than a century ago applied directly to me. In 1897, in one of his lesser-known books, a book titled Following the Equator, Twain wrote this, quote, "All that goes to make the me in me began in a Missouri village." I could not agree more with Twain. The first decade and a half of my life, and much that came after, can be understood only in the context of my growing up in a homogeneous community of German American Catholics, most of them subsistence farmers like my grandfather, who's the second person on your left. And that's a building I went to school in more than a few years ago. These were subsistence farmers whose ancestors, like mine, had immigrated to Osage County, Missouri, more than a century and a half ago. I grew up with a profoundly deep sense of place, a love of the land with its hills and hollers, its vast hardwood forests, and clear spring-fed creeks and rivers. Even now, well into my 8th decade of life in Missouri, one of my favorite places in the world is one that I discovered early in my childhood. It is a high bluff above Cedar Creek in Osage County, near the place of my birth. Beyond the creek, across a fallow field, from this point, I can see the ancestral land that provided meaning and sustenance for multiple generations of my family. This place, known locally as Stieferman's Bluff, is where I go for rest and renewal. This place reminds me of a message from Bernice Reagan, quoted in a book by Carol Stack titled Call to Home. In that book, Reagan says, quote, "If in moving through your life, you find yourself lost, go back to the last place where you knew who you were and what you were doing, and start over again from there." Stieferman's Bluff is that place for me. I grew up in this place. Over time, the place and my experiences there molded me in ways that allowed me to experience, interpret, and shape my very being. This place and its people made me feel like I belonged, like I always had somewhere to go, no matter what was going on in the world around me. I needed that sense of security because I grew up also with an equally profound sense of the fragility and impermanence of life, and a propensity to fear the loss of people I cared deeply about. That was part of my patrimony. My father lost his mother when he was 18 months old. She died of cancer of the kidney. My father never knew his mother, and he suffered her loss throughout his much too short life. He died in 1979 of the same cancer that killed his mother. He was only 65 years old, a decade younger than I now am. My mother, the daughter of a German immigrant father, this is he and the elderly man in the back. I'm the kid with the baseball glove on your far left. My mother, the daughter of a German immigrant who came to this country in 1906, was a middle child of 7 whose mother died suddenly in 1934 when her mother was only 39 and she was 12. My mother's family was so poor when her mother died that they could not afford to pay the mortician's fee of $65 for her funeral and burial. Neighbors took up a collection to help with the expenses, but their nickels and dimes fell far short of being able to pay the bill. So my mother, who was 12, and her sister, who was 14, took a crosscut saw and cut wood for the mortician, hauling it to his house load after load with a team of horses and a wagon. These horses, that wagon, my mother hauling hay. Burdened as they were with grief, they were nonetheless forced to deal with a very adult problem. I think of this often, and I say to myself when I think I've had a bad day, buddy, you've never had a bad day, not like your mother had. Some years later, my mother married her childhood sweetheart when he was home on leave from the Army Air Corps in 1943. After a weekend honeymoon, my mother's new husband, left for the Pacific Theater of War. She never saw him again. He was killed exactly 1 day short of their one-year wedding anniversary. He never met the young daughter who was conceived over that 3-day honeymoon in 1943. And 25 years later, that daughter, my sister, then a wife and mother of a 5-year-old, died suddenly of an aggressive malignant brain tumor. Through the years, my family and I sought comfort and meaning in our Catholic faith, and my childhood was centered around this magnificent Romanesque church that looks totally out of place in a town of 38 people. But the church and the parochial school in my family were the center of my universe. If there was a dominant fear in my childhood, other than the fear of loss, it was the palpably strong fear of communism. And if you're anywhere near my age, you remember this. Although the Soviet Union had been a critical American ally in the fight against the Axis powers during World War II, Americans' fear of the Soviet international ambitions took hold even before the war ended. Arguably, that fear was most forcefully articulated by none other than Winston Churchill, the former and future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. On March 7th, 1946, in response to a personal invitation from Harry Truman, who you can see on the far left, Churchill delivered a momentous speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. It was in that speech, formally titled Sinews of Peace, that Churchill warned against the expansionist policies of the Soviet Union, proclaiming that, quote, an iron curtain had descended across the European continent, end quote, behind which, in a diabolical plot aimed at world domination through a totalitarian state. One curious manifestation of Cold War fear in Missouri was an effort to build a hydrogen bomb factory in Missouri. After the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949, many Americans, including Missouri's native son and President of the United States, Harry Truman, felt the need for the United States to develop an even more powerful weapon of war than those deployed on the citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hydrogen bomb. Although production of the so-called H-bomb was controversial, see Oppenheimer, Harry doesn't come off real well in Oppenheimer. Although production of the so-called H-bomb was controversial in many quarters, Missouri Congressman Albert Sidney Johnson Carnahan, the father of the late Governor Mel Carnahan, quickly latched on to the idea of building a hydrogen bomb factory in Missouri, in the congressional district, of course, that he represented. Carnahan hoped to see the H-bomb factory built amid the rugged natural beauty of the Irish wilderness, which is a 1,258 square mile tract of land spread over Oregon, Shannon, Carter, and Ripley counties in Missouri. The idea was endorsed by the chairman of the Irish Wilderness Development Association, who urged the Missouri governor, Forrest Smith, to support the plan and advocate for it in Washington. Advocates argued that the Irish wilderness met all the requirements for security and seclusion. It was close to power sources, had ample supplies of fresh water and local labor, and good rail connections. Residents of the small Oregon County town of Thayer were strong advocates for building this nuclear plant in their midst, largely because of its promise to bring high-paying jobs. Ultimately, despite Carnahan's appeal, and his personal friendship with Truman, an alternative site outside of Missouri, actually in North Carolina, was chosen. Although at the time, many residents of the Ozarks were disappointed by the decision and the loss of what they hoped would be, again, potential high-paying jobs, future generations of Missourians, I would like to think, who loved the pristine beauty of the Irish wilderness, were forever grateful that it had not become the location of a hydrogen bomb factory. Personally, fear of the Soviets pervaded my childhood and my adolescence. I had continuing nightmares about an invasion of my little town, which, by the way, was called and still is Frankenstein. See, you didn't need to laugh, but I had nightmares about my little town being invaded, my little town of 38 people being invaded by the Soviets, and I was forced to fight them off with my antique .22 rifle pump Winchester as they entered the basement or the cellar of my house. One of the most frightening and memorable events of my adolescent life occurred on the night of October 22nd, 1962. It was a Monday evening, and all of my fellow classmates at St. Thomas Aquinas Preparatory Seminary in Hannibal, Missouri, were in a study hall, a mandatory evening study hall, when a television was brought into the room so that we could all watch President John Kennedy deliver his Cuban Missile Crisis speech. Now, 6 decades later, I still remember the absolute terror I felt in hearing the President of the United States deliver an ultimatum to USSR Premier Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. I and most of the others in my room felt certain that nuclear war and annihilation were imminent. Some of my classmates were crying. Others asked permission to use a phone so they might call their parents in order to say goodbye. Of course, a nuclear war in which all of us died did not occur, but our fear of communism did not diminish. That, of course, is what got us into the quagmire known as the Vietnam War. Among the more than 1,400 Missouri soldiers who went to Vietnam and never came back was my high school classmate and close friend, Paul Hasenbeck of Freeburg, Missouri, who has been missing in action since April 21st, 1967. He was 19 years old, which was the average age of the soldier killed in Vietnam. My effort to understand the historic forces that shaped me and my life led me to explore in this book some of what I came to regard as enduring themes of Missouri history, persistent trends and problems that each generation of Missourians, I think, has struggled to address. One of the most common themes of our history is that of suspicion and hostility toward our federal government. In 2016, when Josh Hawley was running as a candidate for the office of Missouri Attorney General, the only position he wanted, he told a Columbia, Missouri reporter, quote, "The Missouri Attorney General's office should become a platform for challenging federal laws and regulations," end quote. Upon being elected to the office of Attorney General, Hawley proceeded to do just that, as did his successor, Eric Schmidt, and Schmidt's successor, our current Attorney General, Andrew Bailey. Fighting the federal government is a long-standing Missouri tradition, perfectly illustrated in 2021 when the Missouri General Assembly passed the Second Amendment Protection Act. SAPA rather, aimed at nullifying a number of federal gun laws in the state of Missouri. The fact is, we Missourians have been fighting the federal government as long as we've been a state, even before we became a state. The question of whether Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state or a free state placed Missourians at odds with the government they were trying to join. Most Missourians wanted Missouri to be a slave state, and virtually all Missourians, even those who were opposed to slavery, thought it was none of the federal government's damn business whether we became slave or free. Missouri did, of course, become a slave state, but first there was a movement that emerged in Congress to exclude slavery and slaves from the state of Missouri. When that happened, especially because the provision was recommended by a congressman from New York, Missourians were outraged. Thomas Hart Benton, the St. Louis newspaper publisher and future U.S. Senator, became one of the strongest, fiercest opponents of the federal government's effort to restrict slavery in Missouri, arguing that Missourians needed, quote, to make a fair and regular stand against the enactment of Congress upon the sovereignty of the state of the states. Stephen Rector, Surveyor General for Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas, introduced a militant tone into the discussion when he delivered this toast at a Howard County, Missouri gathering in 1890, and I'm quoting, "May the Missourians defend their rights, if necessary, even at the expense of blood, against the unprecedented restriction which was attempted on them by the Congress of the United States." Now think about the irony of that statement. We Missourians were threatening to secede from and go to war against the very government we were trying to join. This inclination of hostility toward and resistance to actions and policies of the federal government, I think, may be one of the most common and persistent impulses that flows through our 200 years of history. There are countless examples of this, evident in every period of our history, including the so-called Honey War during the 1830s and 1840s, when we objected to the borderline between Missouri and Iowa that the federal government tried to impose on us. Residents in this part of the state hardly need reminding of the devastating consequences of the state's clash with the federal government when General Thomas Ewing issued the infamous Order Number 11. Order Number 11, ordering the vacation or vacating of the burnt-over district of Jackson down to Vernon counties because of the perceived threat of guerrillas supporting, or the local residents supporting guerrillas. More than 150 years after that incident occurred, you can still get in a fight with people in western Missouri over that damn general who issued that order. Just a page here. Hold on, forgive me, I am missing a couple pages of my talk somehow. Okay, I'm gonna have to wing it for a page or two. Perhaps the most, I think one of the most interesting cases occurred in 1918 of our fighting the federal government when this man, the Attorney General Frank Winton McAllister, decided to take on the federal government because of a treaty that had been passed with Canada, that had been negotiated with Canada over the protection of certain waterfowl internationally. He happened to be a duck hunter. And he was outraged that it was against the law to kill a wood duck because of this treaty. And so he decided that this was a law he did not need to obey. He subsequently gathered a group of his friends and went out to a marsh near Nevada, Missouri, and in advance called the federal game warden and said, I'm going out and I don't care what you say, I'm going to hunt wood duck. And of course the federal game warden took the bait and showed up, and this state official, the Attorney General of the state of Missouri, and his colleagues had killed a couple of dozen wood ducks. And so he was arrested by the federal marshal, who was promptly arrested by the local sheriff because the marshal didn't have a state hunting license that would allow him to be in possession of Missouri game. The Attorney General was prosecuted in Vernon County and ultimately was found guilty of violating a federal law. He appealed the case. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1920, the United States Supreme Court, not surprisingly, understanding the supremacy law of the United States Constitution, said that this treaty was legitimate and that Missourians had to obey this federal law. It was it was quite an ordeal. One of the most, I think, egregious, long-standing, difficult problems we faced as Missourians has been the problem of race. This is an image of one of the slaves of the Younger family, Sue's Younger. The Missouri Compromise, which I mentioned earlier, put the existence of slavery at the very heart of the discussion about the circumstances and conditions under which Missouri would become a state. Would we be a slave state or a free state? What would be the relationship between blacks and whites? We've been struggling with the issue of race throughout our history. And I think that centrality of race to the Missouri story is has been one of our biggest challenges and continues to be one of our biggest challenges. In 2015, in the midst of the controversy surrounding the killing of Michael Brown and Ferguson and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, a national news magazine referred to Missouri as, quote, the heart of racial tension in America, end quote. During the antebellum period, we passed a number of laws aimed at controlling the black population by restricting their access to education, their mobility, their right to control their own labor, and their interpersonal relations. When enslaved people were finally freed in Missouri on January 11, 1865, which is before the war has ended, we tried to restrict who black people could marry, where they could go to school, where they could live, where they could work, where they could find entertainment, even where they could be buried. Separate cemeteries for African Americans, such as this one in Clinton, Missouri, the Antioch Cemetery, are ubiquitous in our state even today. It's no accident that some of the most important legal cases regarding race to come out of the United States Supreme Court over the past 100 years came out of Missouri. 200 years, I suppose. The famous Dred Scott case in 1857, which originated out of St. Louis. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled against Scott and his effort to obtain his freedom and declared the Missouri Compromise null and void, with Chief Justice Roger Taney proclaiming that no black person had any rights that a white person was obligated to recognize. The Lloyd Gaines case, which aimed to end the University of Missouri's effort to prevent blacks from attending the University of Missouri, began in Columbia, Missouri in 1936, when a black graduate of Lincoln University in Jefferson City tried to enroll in the University of Missouri School of Law. At that time, and this still boggles my mind, at that time, If you were a black student in Missouri and you sought a course of instruction that was not available at the all-black Lincoln University, you would apply to the University of Missouri and be rejected, and then take your letter of rejection to the legislature, and if you were lucky, they would pass a bill authorizing money to be spent to send you out of the state. So many black men and women of that era got their degrees from places like KU, University of Illinois, University of Nebraska, University of Iowa, or Iowa State. Then there, and in fact, the case went to the Supreme Court in 1938, and the United States Supreme Court ruled that Missouri had to either create a separate but equal law school, or it had to admit Lloyd Gaines to the University of Missouri Law School. Missouri was not about to open the University of Missouri-Columbia Law School to a black man. So they created the Lincoln University School of Law, which was inherently inferior. There's no way it could be equal. There's no way they had the money to hire the faculty and to buy the books. But that was the persistence of Missouri's desire to remain an all-white, or the University of Missouri to remain all-white. Then there was the Shelley versus Kremer case, no relation, heard in 1948, which originated in St. Louis out of an effort by a black couple from Starkville, Mississippi, J.D. and Ethel Shelley, who tried to buy this house at 4600 Labadie Street in St. Louis. The house is still standing. 2 days after the family moved into the house in October 1945, two white neighbors sued to evict them, citing a, quote, restrictive covenant, end quote, attached to the house's deed. This was very common in Missouri. The restriction, dating to 1911, barred any owners of the property from transferring property ownership to, quote, persons of the Negro and Mongolian race, end quote. The Missouri Supreme Court came down on the side of the white couple, or the white neighbor, and against the Shelleys, who commented that, quote, all we wanted to do was have a decent place to raise our children, end quote. Ultimately, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Shelleys and voided the use of restrictive covenants that prohibited the sale of real estate to blacks. Another topic that I've sought to explore in this book is our state's relative standing in relationship to other states in the Union over the course of the past century and more. Missouri grew tremendously during the 19th century, largely because of the availability of good farmland at a time when a majority of Americans made their living farming. Many migrants to Missouri were people such as Henry Vest Bingham, father of the famed future artist George Bingham, who had suffered a devastating financial loss back in his birth county of Augusta in Virginia. In the fall of 1818, the elder Bingham set out from Virginia, as the editor of his 1818 diary noted later, quote, to take the road west to begin in search, preferably of land that would raise the crops that were familiar to him, tobacco, corn, and hay. He was searching less for a new way of life than he was for a place where he could re-engage in the life he already knew, a place of promise. He found it in Missouri. On June 17, 1818, Bingham recorded this note in his diary, quote, the lands I have seen in this territory, being with other advantages sufficient to cause me to move here in preference to any other country I have ever seen. Bingham was not alone. Of course, this is the famous painting by his son, Daniel Boone, leading settlers through the Cumberland Gap. Thousands upon thousands of Eastern Americans, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee in particular, left their homes east of the Mississippi River and headed west to John Mason Peck, an itinerant missionary in frontier Missouri, quote, "It seemed as though Kentucky and Tennessee were breaking up and moving to the far west," end quote. An article in the November 10th, 1819 issue of the St. Louis newspaper noted that a St. Charles resident reported that an average of 120 wagons, carriages, and carts passed through St. Charles each week for months. Indeed, Howard County, Missouri, county seat is Fayette, Howard County, Missouri became the fastest growing county in the entire country during the years surrounding Missouri's admission to the Union as the 24th state. And large numbers of people continued to come to Missouri throughout the 19th century. This growth in population was aided by state governmental action, such as that taken by the Missouri General Assembly in February 1865, when it created a state board of immigration. The legislature. That same legislature, well, never mind. A state board of immigration, and authorized the expenditure of funds to send agents to eastern states and to Europe to try to recruit immigrants to come to Missouri. By 1900, Missouri's population reached 3,108,000 people, making it the fifth largest state in the entire country, the fifth largest state in the Union. St. Louis was the fourth largest state or city in the country. Optimism abounded in turn-of-the-century Missouri, with the nation's attention drawn to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904. This is the famous Pike, and the emergence of new technological advances, including the birth of the automobile, seeming to serve as a harbinger of a century of progress. But Missouri has been in relative decline ever since. By 1910, we dropped to the seventh most populous state in the Union. By 1940, we were 10th. By 1970, we had dropped to 13th. During the 1980s, Kansas City actually supplanted St. Louis as our state's most populous city, with, I think, the 1985 World Series serving as a metaphor for the decline of St. Louis. Here you see on the far right the two St. Louis, Missouri United States Senators, Tom Eagleton and John Danforth, having to suck it up and go celebrate the Kansas City Royals' victory. By 2020, Missouri was the 18th most populous state in the Union. 62 of Missouri's 115 counties, if you include the city of St. Louis, lost population between 2019 and 2020. Put simply, over the course of the past century, immigrants and migrants from other counties and countries and states increasingly have found Missouri a less desirable place to live than many other parts of the country. Why? Not sure. But one possible answer is that we have been way too long in following the same advice about what will attract people to our state for more than 2 centuries. Namely, that low taxes would and will result in more and more people wanting to come here. This started with our very first governor, Alexander McNair, who laid out a vision for Missouri in his 1821 inaugural address. He said, quote, "As we expect to increase in wealth and numbers by the accession of citizens from other states, it is our policy to remove every obstacle and hold out every inducement to immigration. A key element of this effort would require, quote, the establishment of a rigid economy in every department of the state and the retrenchment of every unnecessary expense. In short, if state government would hold expenses down and keep taxes low, more people would want to come here to live. And those immigrants would, quote, divide and diminish the burden of taxation," end quote. Our state history is littered with people and policies aimed at reducing or limiting taxes in the hope that we will attract more people to Missouri. No one expressed this sentiment better than a Democratic governor, John Phelps, a Springfield lawyer elected as governor in 1876. Phelps said this in his inaugural address, I'm quoting, "We must economize. We must reduce the expenditures of government. It may be difficult to do so, but it must be done." He elaborated, quote, "We should endeavor to place taxation at its lowest limit. We invite the population, and if to all of our other sources of wealth and prosperity, we can with truth say the taxes of the municipal and state governments are low, we offer strong inducements for the enterprising, industrious, and intelligent people to make their abode with us," end quote. In short, the contention was and is that low taxes would and will bring increased population, which in turn would and will result in prosperity and improved well-being for all of us. A century or so later, we enshrined this low-tax philosophy in our state's constitution through passage of the Hancock Amendment in 1980, and Hancock II, we didn't think it was restrict enough in 1980, so we made it even more restrictive in 1994 with Hancock II. Arguably, this emphasis on government frugality has handicapped our ability to build the state's infrastructure and provide services that residents and would-be residents expect. Just recently, the Missouri Department of Economic Development made clear that, quote, "Missouri's growth in GDP and productivity has been below the nation and Missouri's Midwestern peers since 2010, 13 years. Sadly, we find our state ranking poorly among our sister states in terms of services provided to citizens. The 2021-2022 National Education Association Rankings and Estimates report places Missouri teachers at 47th for average pay in the nation. Missouri's starting pay for teachers, $34,000, is 50th among the 50 states. Missouri ranks 43rd among the states in terms of public safety. In 2020, Missouri ranked 40th in terms of life expectancy, with Missourians expected to live 1.9 fewer years than the national average. We are the 8th worst in the nation in terms of road conditions. We rank 47th in the country in overall health care. We have a 14% uninsured rate in the state, which ranks us 38th among the states. We rank 16th highest in suicide rates. One of the few things in which we rank number one in the country is in meth production. But all is not dismal and dire here in Missouri. After all, we do have the Kansas City Chiefs. And we have the Kansas City Royals and the St. Louis Cardinals, even if both of them had less than stellar years. We have professional soccer and hockey. We have world-class museums and art galleries, such as the Nelson Atkins just down the street, the St. Louis Art Museum, the Spiva Art Center in Joplin, and the Dom Music of Contemporary Art in Sedalia. We have the St. Louis and Kansas City zoos, the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis and the Powell Gardens near Kansas City. We have Silver Dollar City and the world headquarters of Bass Pro, described recently by a writer for Atlantic as one of the best-run retail operations in the entire United States. We have Washington University, which consistently ranks among the top 20 universities in the United States. And we have a good selection of public and private institutions of higher learning in the state, including the University of Missouri at Kansas City. Our state parks and State Department of Conservation provide a great variety of venues through which we can enjoy the beauties and the wonders of the natural world. And our lakes, rivers, and streams are among the most beautiful and inviting in the entire country. As we enter our third century of statehood, perhaps it is appropriate to ponder how we might rekindle the notion of our state as a place of promise, where citizens and governmental officials work together to find the right balance between public support and private initiative so that public services that citizens expect can be provided without stifling the creative energy that has always been a part of the Missouri experience. Perhaps there are or can be reasons to live in Missouri other than a low tax rate. I have hope for my native state. The famous Missouri artist who made his home here, Thomas Hart Benton, once remarked, "I like the men and women who make the real Missouri. I get along with them." I feel the same way. The state and its people sometimes confuse and confound me, often annoy and aggravate me, but I've never not loved it and them. My own life has become so intertwined with the history of this state that it is sometimes hard for me to separate my own past from that of this state. It and I are one, though we are sometimes at war and on the verge of disowning each other. Missouri is my home. It always has been. It always will be. 7 generations of my family have lived here. Most of us have died here or will die here. Missouri and its people belong to me and I to them. So this evening, I say with hope, tempered by an understanding of our complex past, may Missouri always be a place of promise, and may our third century of statehood be the time in which that promise is fulfilled. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you. I think we have time for questions, and if you have a question, would you come to one of the microphones in the front, please?
Yeah, I have a question about St. Louis. When I was born in St. Louis in the 1950s, I think the population was about 800,000.
That's
today
right.
It's under 300 and declining. And I think the fate of St. Louis has drugged down the state overall, since it was the economic engine. I'm interested in your theory as to why St. Louis has had such a precipitous decline over the last 50 years or so.
As stated only by as a Kansas City and could, right? I think it's a long, complicated story. I think a lot of it has to do with race. There's been a tremendous outmigration. Now, Kansas City has suffered that same problem, the white flight of the 1950s and 60s, but it was more dramatic in St. Louis. And in fact, the black population of St. Louis and Kansas City are very different, in that the black population of St. Louis is less well educated than the black population of Kansas City. But I think a lot of it has to do with, again, with race. A lot of it has to do with violence. St. Louis is always in the top 2 or 3 in terms of murder. It also has a lot to do with the fragmentation of St. Louis, the so-called Great Divorce that occurred in 1876. You've got, maybe 200 municipalities. Now there is a push to try to bring them all back together. In 1876, St. Louis said it didn't want those provincial suburbs. Now they want the tax base and they want them back. So I think it's complicated, but I think St. Louis has in many ways been its own enemy. And I'm not sure what the fix is going to be. because I think it's going to continue to decline. It's still a significant engine of the economy, the metropolitan area, but the city proper is, as you note, has really suffered. Thanks for your question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so many questions, so little time. But my one question is rural-urban conflict in Missouri, which is, from what I understand, some of the worst in the country. Governor Parsons said in the middle of a city, I am an agricultural governor, made that flat-out statement. I admire his honesty and forthrightness, which isn't typical of politicians, but that sort of hostility, conflict is, I think, quite damaging. What can be done to kind of ameliorate that sort of thing?
I'm a historian. I look backward, not forward. But first of all, I would make the point that the urban-rural battle has been with us since the beginning.
Sure.
In 1820, when Missourians were talking about voting on a constitution and creating a new government, there was outstate hostility toward what they regarded as the undue representation St. Louis had. They had too big of a vote. I think, first of all, it has to be acknowledged. I don't think it is acknowledged. And, I think both sections, the rural and the urban, have to understand that they need each other. Sure. And that might be the starting point, because they really do. I don't see this changing particularly quickly, but the legislature is dominated by rural counties. And in fact, there's always been the split in the legislature between St. Louis and Kansas City, but the split between the rural areas and the urban areas is even more pronounced in my judgment. So I think first simply acknowledge it and then start talking to each other and recognize the contributions that both areas make. But we are not going to be a rural state again. The dominance of the urban areas is clear, and it's been with us. We became an urban state during the decade of the 1920s, but we still act as though we're in the 19th century.
They just won't have it. The country folk won't have it. So, anyway.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
I am not from Missouri. I'm from Los Angeles, but I've been a social worker here for 30 years. I agree with everything you say, especially about the issues of the racial divide.
You can just stop there with, I agree with everything you say.
Oh, well, but I have a question based on everything you say. You said at the end that you have hope. And as somebody, everything you mentioned that was positive about Missouri is available, for example, only to the upper middle class and above. None of those things are available to the poor or the working class. How do those of us who work on behalf of those who are oppressed by poverty and race, economic division, the rural or urban divide, all of that, you say you have hope. How? A, how? And B, how do you suggest that those of us who work on these issues impact these issues? Because I would doubt that Missouri, like any other state, is more than 50% of people who have been here for 5 generations. Because of industry especially, there are more people in Kansas City who are not from here than are from here. So I want to know how you push forward that hope.
I guess I'm hopeful just because that is who I am. I'm a child of the 60s who still thinks I can save the world.
Me too, but it's not working.
There is no answer short of changing the composition of the people who make the decisions. We've got to vote for different people who share our vision and our views. The fact is that not just in Missouri, but in the entire country, the wealth gap is getting bigger, and it's really been exacerbated by the the pandemic, it seems to me. So somehow we've got to figure out a way to recompose the lawmaking bodies of the state. And one of the big ways that we could do that is if urban Missourians voted the way rural Missourians do, I mean in numbers,
Yeah.
urban Missouri would control this state, but they don't. There is a high, and you know, there's a high incidence of not voting, especially among young urban Missourians. One of the things that we're facing right now, and you're starting to see some real publicity about it, is that Missouri is losing college-educated people. They're going elsewhere. And again, it's not because they're not staying here, not because of our low taxes. They're not staying here because they don't like our social policies with regard to gay marriage or book banning or our gun laws. I am going to get in big trouble here, but it hasn't been that long ago since Missouri had some of the strictest gun laws in the entire country, 2 decades. And now we have some of the loosest. So I don't have an answer for you. I wish I did, other than somehow we've got to get people to change the composition of the electorate.
I hope you're meeting with the Kansas City Star editorial board, whatever form it currently exists in.
Thank you, ma'am.
Gary, I'm going to jump in here just real quick to say we'll finish up with these 3 people that are in line here. Also to let you know, there is one change tonight. If you've been here the last few weeks, you might have noticed we've been having a few point of sale problems. So we're doing something a little different tonight. We decided to focus instead on ensuring that we had ample copies of the book in our collection. But this is a fantastic Christmas gift. I've already bought 3. So if you are interested, QR code. This will take you to the University of Missouri Press website. You can buy it directly from them. It's the same price as it is on Amazon. I already checked. And you support a great university press. So check that out. Carry on.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. I think we're on exactly the same page in terms of when history began, because I guess for most people, history begins on the day you're born, right? So thank you for these people who know better. But I want to take you back to the 1940s, before there were you or I, and you had a comment about Truman and how the Oppenheimer movie kind of did not treat him well. I just finished reading O'Reilly's book, Killing the Rising Sun, and I highly recommend it. In there, I learned things about what my father went through. He was in the Pacific Theater, and I am here. And I'm one of those people who are pretty dang sure that I would not have been here if Truman had not made decisions he did, and he made them for reasons. And the threat of the Soviet Union at that time was in fact real. And I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts were, because you kind of brushed over it, and I knew you had a lot to get through, but how do you feel about Truman
I think, well, first of all, my father was in the South Pacific too. Spent 2 years in the Philippines, in the jungles. The best way to get a rile out of my dad was when he listened to the evening news during Vietnam, and they said this is the first jungle warfare Americans have ever engaged in. He knew better. He lived off a water buffalo for 2 years. No, I think I'm very positive about Harry Truman. Oh, my reference to Oppenheimer was just if you saw the movie, I think they sort of made fun of Harry in the movie, and I think that was unfair. I can't imagine the burden of choice that he had to make, and I think his choice probably saved our dads.
Yeah.
But so and Truman has come into his own, as has Eisenhower, by the way. Eisenhower is looked at much more favorably now than he was 20 or 30 years ago. But so I'm not sure what you want me to say, except that I think Truman was a really good president.
Yeah, and I guess what I really wanted to get to is films like Oppenheimer, which I haven't even seen yet because I haven't had 3 hours to devote to it.
Yeah, it's a good movie, but it's long.
it's not real. I mean, it's not real history. It's not the digging into what was really going on back then, which was painful to even read. But
Yeah, but I think what it does, what I hope it does, is, as any good movie or historical fiction does, is excite your interest in learning more about the subject. And I think that did in fact happen.
thank you.
Thank you for being here. Yes, ma'am.
I don't remember the exact name of the governmental organization, but something about the Department of Immigration. Whatever happened to that? And and if it's gone, maybe we could use it to have people immigrate from California and adopt our ways.
Well, it disappeared out of a desire to cut government spending, which is often the case. It's hard to imagine currently that we would create a board of immigration to try to solicit people to come to the state of Missouri. One last question.
What was it like to be a kid in small town Fredericksburg?
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
My grandson. I didn't prompt him to ask that question, but I must say, looking back, it was the safest, most comfortable world I've ever known. I didn't know anybody who wasn't German and Catholic. I thought the whole damn world was German and Catholic. And I couldn't imagine why anyone would ever want to leave Frankenstein, Missouri. I didn't know any other world. And it was safe, it was comfortable. I mean, it was all the stereotypes that you hear of we never locked our house. Hell, we never had a key to the house. It was a very safe and pleasant world, which is why I go back there to remind myself of that childhood. But it was also, I think it did not prepare me for the world in which I eventually came to live in. I didn't know any black people. I've written a number of books on Missouri's black history. I didn't know a black person in my childhood. There was one black person in the entire county in which I lived. I had to go to Lincoln University, all black Lincoln University as an undergraduate, to meet people from first of all, African Americans, but also people from other countries and people who weren't German and Catholic. So the answer to your question is it was my childhood was a wonderful growing up of feeling absolutely safe. Disappearing in the morning and your parents didn't worry about where you were or what you were doing. Well, they probably did a little bit, but it was a very different world. I can't imagine anyone today having that kind of sense of security and safety. Thanks for your question. Thank you all very much.